Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of rural Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1953, the small town of Millbrook, Virginia, found itself under the shadow of an enigma, a charismatic preacher whose promise to God would ultimately lead to one of the most disturbing incidents in the region's history. Nestled between the rolling Blue Ridge foothills and dense pine forests that seemed to trap sound and secrets alike, Millbrook was home to barely 1,200 souls, the type of close-knit community where generations of families lived side by side, where conversations paused when strangers entered the general store, and where the church bell's toll each Sunday morning was as reliable as the sunrise. The roads leading into Millbrook were narrow and winding, often shrouded in morning mist that clung to the valleys like a spectral blanket. The town itself consisted of a modest main street with a handful of essential businesses: Caldwell's Pharmacy, First Millbrook Bank, Johnson's General Store, a small post office, and the Wayside Diner, where locals gathered for coffee and conversation. Houses spread outward from this center, growing more dispersed until they gave way to scattered farmsteads that had sustained families for generations. Electricity had reached most homes by the 1940s, but telephone service remained limited to the town proper and a few of the larger farms. This physical isolation was mirrored in the town's mental landscape, a place where news from the outside world arrived primarily through newspaper deliveries and radio broadcasts that sometimes crackled with static when weather conditions were poor. Providence Baptist Church stood on Larson Hill Road, a winding gravel path approximately 3 miles from town. Built in 1887 during a period of religious revival, the white clapboard structure had weathered countless storms, its aging wooden bones creaking during winter winds. The modest steeple, visibly tilting after decades of weathering, could be seen from most vantage points in town, a beacon of stability in an increasingly uncertain post-war world. The cemetery surrounding the church contained headstones dating back to the Civil War, many bearing the same family names still found on mailboxes throughout the county. Elm trees, old and gnarled, cast dappled shadows across the graves during summer days and stood like silent sentinels during winter months when their bare branches clawed at the gray sky. Behind the church, a dense stand of pine trees marked the boundary where church property met the vast forest that stretched toward the mountains. County records show that by 1950, Providence Baptist had fallen on difficult times. The post-war economic boom had drawn many younger residents to larger cities like Richmond and Washington, D.C., leaving behind an aging congregation of barely 30 regular attendees. The church minutes from quarterly meetings during this period reveal recurring concerns about finances, building maintenance, and the growing difficulty in finding a permanent pastor. Most troubling were notations regarding the church's outdated electrical wiring and the ancient coal furnace in the basement that required constant attention during harsh Virginia winters. As documented in the March 1951 meeting notes, Deacon Thomas Phillips reported, "Furnace continues to function poorly despite repairs. Basement walls show signs of moisture damage, particularly near the northwest corner. Estimated cost for comprehensive repairs exceeds our current building fund by substantial margin." The decision to postpone these repairs, made due to financial constraints, would later prove tragically consequential. For nearly 2 years, visiting pastors from neighboring communities had rotated Sunday duties at Providence, but enthusiasm was waning. As noted in the diary of Margaret Simmons, church secretary, today only 16 in attendance. Reverend Williams from Bedford seemed discouraged by the empty pews. Mrs. Holcomb suggests we may need to consider joining with Riverside Methodist if our numbers continue to dwindle. The collection barely covered the electricity bill, This decline mirrored a pattern seen in many rural American communities of that era. While the 1950s marked a significant religious boom nationally, with church attendance reaching unprecedented levels, this revival was concentrated primarily in suburban areas where new churches were being constructed at a record pace to accommodate growing populations. Rural churches, particularly those in economically stagnant regions, often struggled as younger members departed for opportunities elsewhere. In Millbrook, this demographic shift left Providence Baptist with a congregation consisting primarily of elderly members, a handful of middle-aged farmers and shopkeepers, and precious few young families or children. The arrival of Reverend Lawrence Gideon Mercer in April 1952 thus appeared to many as divine intervention. Tall and striking, with unusual gray eyes that seemed to change shade depending on the light, Mercer arrived in Millbrook driving a well-maintained black Packard, a detail that immediately set tongues wagging in a town where such luxury was rare. His clothing, while not ostentatious, suggested comfort and quality beyond what most local residents could afford. He spoke with a refined accent that was difficult to place geographically. Not quite Southern, yet not distinctly Northern either. According to town council minutes, he presented himself at the mayor's office with a letter of introduction, purportedly from a Baptist seminary in Ohio, though subsequent investigations would reveal that no such institution existed under the name provided. When questioned about his background during his first meeting with the church board, Mercer offered vague references to missionary work overseas and pastoral positions in several small communities across the Midwest. He attributed his lack of extensive documentation to an unfortunate fire at his previous residence that had destroyed many of his personal records. What couldn't be questioned was the immediate effect Mercer had on the Providence congregation. His first sermon, delivered to a sparse gathering of curious locals, left a profound impression. Mabel Johnson, who operated the Wayside Diner, wrote to her sister in Richmond, "The new preacher has a way of speaking that makes you feel he's addressing you personally. His eyes seem to find yours even across the room. Several people who haven't attended in years came out to hear him, and I suspect they'll be back next Sunday." Within 6 weeks of his first sermon, attendance had nearly doubled. By autumn, the previously sparse collection plates were filling with dollars instead of coins. As Christmas approached, the church held its first completely full service in over a decade. Where once they struggled to find volunteers for church activities, they now had waiting lists for committee positions. The children's Sunday school, which had dwindled to just 5 regular attendees, suddenly boasted over 20 enthusiastic youngsters. Harriet Wells, then 83 and the town's unofficial historian, recorded her impressions in a journal later recovered from her bedside table. "Something about the new reverend unsettles me, though I cannot articulate precisely why. His words flow like honey, but leave a strange aftertaste. People seem entranced when he speaks, particularly the women and the infirm." Martha Simmons, whose arthritis has confined her mostly to home these past years, now manages to attend every service and has taken to baking pies for the Reverend 3 times weekly, though her hands can barely grasp a rolling pin. When I mentioned this to my daughter, she merely smiled in that vacant way and said, "Reverend Mercer brings out strength we didn't know we possessed." What made Mercer's sermon so compelling was not theological sophistication. Indeed, several visiting clergy members who attended services remarked privately on the rather simplistic biblical interpretations he offered. Rather, it was his delivery that captivated listeners. He had a remarkable ability to modulate his voice, sometimes dropping to a near whisper that forced the congregation to lean forward in their pews, then building to resonant declarations that seemed to vibrate the very air of the sanctuary. He moved about the pulpit with unusual energy, occasionally stepping down to walk the center aisle while maintaining unbroken eye contact with individual parishioners. His sermons gradually evolved to emphasize several recurring themes: the corruption of the modern world, the special selection of his congregation as vessels of divine purpose, and most prominently, the concept of transformation through sacrifice. True faith, he often declared, requires more than words or even deeds. It demands a willingness to surrender completely to God's will, to offer oneself entirely as Abraham was prepared to offer Isaac. The first documented indications of Mercer's unusual behaviors emerged during the harsh winter of 1952-53. According to police reports filed with the Millbrook sheriff but never thoroughly investigated, Mercer began requiring certain members of the congregation to attend what he called covenant sessions in the church basement. These meetings, held on Wednesday and Friday evenings, often lasted until dawn, with participants emerging exhausted yet strangely animated, their eyes bright despite obvious fatigue. The church basement, originally constructed as a simple utility space, underwent significant modifications during this period. Hardware store receipts indicate purchases of soundproofing materials, specialized lighting equipment, and unusual quantities of mirrors that were installed along the basement walls. The furnace room was sealed off with a new door featuring an elaborate lock system accessible only through a key Mercer kept on his person at all times. When questioned by concerned family members, attendees of these sessions would only respond that they were preparing for the fulfillment of a sacred promise. Several spouses reported that their partners returned from these sessions seemingly different, more distant, speaking in biblical references that seemed out of character, and displaying an unusual preoccupation with concepts of purification and transcendence. Virginia Caldwell, whose family operated Millbrook's only pharmacy, recalled in a 1964 interview with the County Historical Society how her mother changed after attending these sessions. She became withdrawn, barely speaking except to quote scripture or reference Reverend Mercer's teachings. She would stare at empty corners of rooms as if seeing something none of us could perceive. When I expressed concern about the late-night meetings, she just smiled this strange, peaceful smile and said, "Reverend Mercer has made a promise to God, and we have been chosen to help him fulfill it. You're too young to understand the honor." By early 1953, Mercer had instituted what he termed purification rituals during Sunday services, lengthy, emotionally charged ceremonies where congregants would publicly confess their sins with an unprecedented level of detail. These confessions, often tearful and intensely personal, created a complex web of shared secrets among the congregation members. Individuals who had once maintained careful privacy now revealed their deepest transgressions before their neighbors. Affairs, financial improprieties, buried resentments, and long-held jealousies. Courthouse records from that spring show an unusual spike in divorce filings, property disputes, and even criminal investigations, stemming directly from revelations made during these rituals. The social fabric of Millbrook, woven tightly through generations of shared history, began to visibly fray. Lifelong friendships dissolved overnight. Business partnerships collapsed. Extended families who had gathered for Sunday dinners for decades now avoided each other in public. Yet, paradoxically, as these external social bonds weakened, the internal cohesion of Mercer's core followers strengthened. They began referring to themselves as the vessels, a term Mercer introduced to designate those who had fully committed to his teachings. They developed distinctive patterns of speech, greeting each other with phrases like "blessed transformation" and responding with "the promise endures." They took to wearing small copper pins shaped like stylized flames crafted by the local blacksmith under Mercer's specific direction. Sheriff Dale Montgomery, a pragmatic man with 23 years in law enforcement, received several complaints about strange noises from the church at odd hours, chanting, occasional screams described as religious ecstasy, and rhythmic pounding that echoed through the nearby woods. Each investigation ended with apologetic congregants insisting they were simply overcome with the Spirit. Montgomery later admitted to his deputy, James Crawford, that he felt an inexplicable reluctance to press these matters further, describing a strange pressure to abandon inquiries whenever he spoke with Mercer directly. Something in his eyes makes you want to agree with whatever he's saying, Montgomery noted in a personal journal discovered after his death in 1972. I've interviewed murderers who didn't unsettle me the way Mercer does when he fixes that stare on you. Today, he placed his hand on my shoulder when I mentioned noise complaints, and I swear I felt a buzzing sensation travel down my spine. Found myself apologizing to him before I left, though for what, I couldn't say. The dynamics at work in Millbrook during this period reflected broader patterns observed in isolated rural communities that become susceptible to charismatic religious leadership. The post-war era had brought profound social and economic changes that left many rural residents feeling disconnected from the national prosperity and cultural shifts they witnessed on their newly purchased television sets. In communities like Millbrook, where traditional social structures were weakening as younger generations departed, religious institutions often served as the final bastion of stability and community identity. A study conducted by sociologists at the University of Virginia in the 1960s documented how rural churches in economically depressed areas functioned not merely as religious centers, but as essential social anchors. When these institutions fell under the influence of manipulative leadership, the consequences could be particularly severe due to limited external oversight and the high social cost of dissent in close-knit communities, where church participation was integral to one's social standing. In June 1953, Mercer's sermons took a decisive turn. He began preaching extensively about what he called the coming purification. His rhetoric, preserved in transcripts meticulously recorded by devoted follower Agnes Porter, later found in a metal box buried beneath her garden shed, grew increasingly fixated on fire as a cleansing agent. Fire separates the pure from the corrupt, he declared in one particularly fervent sermon. Through the holy flames, God reveals his chosen ones. Those who emerge transformed from the crucible are marked for glory beyond this temporal existence. His descriptions of this purification became increasingly vivid and disturbing. He spoke of flesh rendered to spirit through sacred flame, of mortal boundaries dissolved in the crucible of divine purpose, and of transcendence achieved through the willing surrender to holy fire. These concepts were intermingled with obscure biblical references and, what later analysis would reveal, were passages loosely adapted from ancient Zoroastrian texts dealing with fire worship. That same month, Millbrook experienced 3 small fires of suspicious origin, one at the abandoned sawmill at the edge of town, another at the elementary school storage shed, and a third in the dense woods directly behind Providence Baptist. Though no direct connection to Mercer was established by the rudimentary investigation, volunteer firefighter Joseph Reynolds noted in his logbook that he spotted the Reverend watching the mill fire from a distance, making no move to report it or assist in extinguishing the blaze. He stood motionless on Miller's Hill, Reynolds wrote. The flames reflected in his eyes even from that distance. When I approached to ask if he'd seen how it started, he smiled and said something strange. Beautiful, isn't it? How it consumes impurity. I mentioned there was nothing impure about Mr. Patterson's lumber stock, and he just patted my shoulder and walked away. Felt chilled despite standing near the fire. As summer progressed, Mercer introduced a new element to his covenant sessions, what he termed flame meditation. Participants later described sitting in circles around small braziers containing aromatic substances that produced colorful flames and thick, sweet-smelling smoke. They would stare into these flames while Mercer led them through lengthy chants and breathing exercises. Many reported experiencing vivid hallucinations during these sessions, visions of themselves walking through fire unharmed, of their bodies dissolving into pure light, or of emerging transformed from consuming flames. Chemical analysis of residue recovered from the church basement after the incident would later identify compounds consistent with substances known to produce hallucinogenic effects when burned, including derivatives of certain mushrooms, exotic resins, and trace amounts of chemical compounds that would not be formally classified by pharmacologists until decades later. By late summer, approximately 20 core members of the congregation, those who attended every covenant session, had begun selling their possessions. County property records show 5 families liquidating farms that had been in their possession for generations, while others sold automobiles, heirloom jewelry, and in one case, a valuable collection of Civil War artifacts. The proceeds, according to bank records subpoenaed in 1954, were deposited into what Mercer called the Purification Fund, an account under his name at Millbrook Savings and Loan that eventually held over $27,000, equivalent to about $280,000 today. These transactions raised eyebrows among the town's business leaders, but when banker Thomas Whitfield attempted to speak with some of the depositors, he reported they became defensive and hostile. Eleanor Mitchell, whose family I've served for 30 years, told me her financial decisions were ordained by higher authority than some small-town money counter, Whitfield later testified. When I expressed concern about her children's future after she'd liquidated their inheritance, she informed me they were being prepared for a glory beyond worldly wealth. The bank manager noted that Mercer withdrew large sums in cash over a 3-week period in October 1953. During this period, Mercer also began speaking privately to his inner circle about his promise to God, a covenant he claimed to have made during a near-death experience in his youth. Though accounts vary slightly, the essence of this promise, as related by survivors, involved Mercer's pledge to deliver purified souls to the divine realm, in exchange for his own salvation and special insights granted to him by what he termed the Voice, an entity he claimed spoke to him during moments of deep meditation. Margaret Wilson, a seamstress who lived in a small cottage directly across from the church, reported seeing unusual deliveries arriving after dark throughout October, large metal drums being unloaded from unmarked trucks, quantities of mechanical equipment, and numerous containers labeled as industrial chemicals. When she inquired with Deacon Phillips about the deliveries, she was told they were materials for renovating the church basement, and was politely but firmly advised to mind her own affairs. I didn't think much of it at the time, and Wilson later stated to investigators. There had been talk of fixing the furnace and addressing the moisture problems in the basement for years. But looking back, I remember feeling uneasy about the way those deliveries always happened after midnight, and how the men unloading them worked in near complete silence. On November 1, 1953, Mercer announced a special midnight service to be held 2 weeks later, on the 15th. According to survivors' accounts, he claimed during this announcement that God had spoken to him directly the previous night, demanding a demonstration of absolute faith. Only those who gather on the appointed night will be marked for salvation, he reportedly stated. Those who doubt or fail to attend will be left behind when the transformation occurs. In the days that followed this proclamation, several long-standing members of the congregation who had remained somewhat distant from Mercer's inner circle reported receiving late-night visits from groups of his followers. These visitors, described as eerily serene with mechanical smiles, urged attendance at the special service, warning of spiritual consequences for those who refused. 3 families who received such visits opted to leave town temporarily, citing discomfort with the escalating fervor. As the date approached, Mercer intensified his preparatory covenant sessions. Participants later described marathon gatherings lasting up to 18 hours, during which they were permitted neither food nor sleep. They engaged in continuous chanting, prolonged meditation before the flame braziers, and group recitations of what Mercer called transformation prayers, lengthy, repetitive incantations that combined biblical passages with phrases in a language none of the participants recognized. Physical exhaustion, sensory manipulation, sleep deprivation, and exposure to hallucinogenic substances created a state of extreme suggestibility among these core followers. Several psychological studies conducted years later on survivors of similar high-control religious groups have documented how these techniques effectively break down critical thinking and personal boundaries, rendering individuals highly susceptible to suggestion and prone to experiencing powerful, shared delusions. What makes the events of November 15th particularly disturbing is the methodical preparation, evident in retrospect. County records show that in September, Mercer had applied for unusual building permits, ostensibly for heating system improvements that included ventilation modifications to the church basement and the installation of additional locks on the basement access doors. Hardware store receipts found in church records show purchases of industrial-grade padlocks, chain, and materials that fire investigators would later identify as commonly used in manufacturing improvised incendiary devices. The modifications to the church building were extensive and clearly designed with specific intent. Ventilation ducts were installed, connecting the furnace room to discrete outlets positioned throughout the sanctuary. The church organ, a modest pipe instrument dating from 1912, underwent what was described as restoration work, performed by an unidentified specialist brought in by Mercer. This work, as later investigation would reveal, included modifications to several pipes to function as aerosol dispersal devices connected to the ventilation system. Most troubling were the alterations to the church's exits. New door frames were installed on all exterior doors under the guise of addressing draft issues, but these frames included concealed brackets designed to accommodate heavy crossbars. The windows, previously simple to open for ventilation, were subtly modified with stops that limited how far they could be raised, not enough to prevent air circulation, but sufficient to prevent an adult from climbing through. The service began at midnight as promised. 37 people attended, representing nearly everyone who had fallen under Mercer's most direct influence. Conspicuously absent were 8 individuals who had been among his most devoted followers, all members of the church board who had signed over substantial property or funds to Mercer's purification fund. These 8 had been sent on what Mercer described as a preparatory mission to Washington, D.C., that morning purportedly to acquire final materials needed for the transformation. Accounts of the service itself are necessarily limited, as most participants did not survive to provide testimony. However, Margaret Wilson, who remained awake that night, due to concern about the unusual gathering, observed the proceedings through her window using a pair of opera glasses. Her detailed statement provided to investigators while she was hospitalized for severe respiratory issues resulting from smoke inhalation offers the most comprehensive eyewitness account. According to Wilson, the service began conventionally enough, with hymn singing and prayer. Mercer, dressed in an unusual white robe adorned with copper symbols resembling flames, delivered what appeared to be a particularly impassioned sermon. As midnight approached, attendees were directed to drink from a communal chalice passed among them. Wilson noted that several individuals appeared disoriented after consuming the liquid, with movements becoming less coordinated and expressions increasingly vacant. At approximately 1:30 a.m., Mercer directed the congregation to kneel in a circle around the altar while he moved to the organ. He played a discordant sequence of notes repeatedly, while reciting what Wilson described as words in no language I've ever heard. The congregation began swaying rhythmically, many with arms raised. Wilson reported seeing a strange mist beginning to fill the sanctuary, emerging from the organ pipes and ventilation grates. At approximately 2:17 a.m. on November 16th, resident Edwin Parker was returning from a late shift at the paper mill when he noticed an unusual glow emanating from the church windows. As he approached to investigate, he heard what he later described as a sound like rushing wind mixed with distant voices chanting in unison. Moments before, the windows blew out in a shower of glass, and flames erupted from multiple points in the building simultaneously. Parker's testimony, given from his hospital bed while recovering from cuts sustained from flying debris, describes the scene in chilling detail. The flames weren't normal. They burned with a strange bluish tint at the edges and spread faster than anything I've ever seen. But what haunts me most was how nobody ran out. Nobody screamed or called for help. Through the broken windows, I could see shapes moving inside, silhouettes against the flames, and they weren't panicking. Some appeared to be sitting calmly in the pews, while others raised their arms as if in worship. It was like they were welcoming it. The Millbrook Volunteer Fire Department arrived within 12 minutes of Parker's frantic call from the nearest farmhouse telephone, but by then, the wooden structure was fully engulfed. Fire Chief Walter Simmons later testified that the front and side doors appeared to have been barred from the inside with heavy chains, an observation confirmed by the subsequent investigation. More disturbing still, when firefighters finally breached the rear entrance, they found most victims seated in the pews, making no apparent attempt to escape. In 27 years of firefighting, I've never seen anything like it, Simmons stated in his official report. Victims of house fires are typically found near exits or windows, trying to escape. These people were arranged as if still attending service. Some had their heads bowed, as if in prayer. Others were standing with arms raised. Not one appeared to have moved from their places once the fire began. The intensity of the fire was exceptional, with temperatures estimated to have reached over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to warp metal and reduce human remains to ash in certain areas of the building. This extreme heat, combined with the rapid spread of the flames, suggested the use of multiple accelerants strategically placed throughout the structure. Yet even accounting for these factors, fire investigation experts remained puzzled by the lack of survival instinct displayed by the victims. The official death toll reached 34, including, supposedly, Reverend Mercer, whose body was reportedly found at the pulpit, arms outstretched in what witnesses described as a posture of offering. I say supposedly because subsequent forensic investigation raised troubling questions. The body, identified as Mercer's, showed evidence of having been dead for at least several hours before the fire started, with blood pooling inconsistent with a person who died while standing. Furthermore, dental records obtained from a dentist in Richmond, whom Mercer had visited only once, did not match conclusively with the recovered remains. These discrepancies led some investigators to question whether the body at the pulpit was actually Mercer's, though the extreme damage caused by the fire made definitive identification impossible with the forensic techniques available at that time. The most disturbing discovery came 3 days later, when investigators examining the church basement found an elaborate system of pipes connected to what remained of several large metal containers. Chemical analysis identified traces of multiple accelerants and an unusual compound that forensic experts suggested might produce hallucinogenic or sedative effects when burned or aerosolized. Of equal concern was what investigators found in the church organ pipes, modified to connect to the ventilation system. Residue tests revealed traces of a substance later identified as a primitive form of what we now know as aerosolized LSD, mixed with compounds that would induce both euphoria and extreme suggestibility. The delivery system appeared designed to gradually saturate the sanctuary with these substances throughout the service, explaining the lack of panic or self-preservation instincts among the victims. The basement also contained a small room that had been sealed off from the main area, accessible only through a hidden door disguised as part of the wall paneling. Inside this room, investigators found a narrow cot, basic survival supplies, and most significantly, a tunnel approximately 30 feet long that led to an exit point in the dense woods behind the church. The existence of this escape route strongly suggested premeditation and raised further questions about Mercer's fate. The 8 absent church members, those sent to Washington, D.C. that morning, never returned to Millbrook. Attempts to locate them through family connections, banking records, or transportation manifests proved fruitless. However, over the following decade, unconfirmed reports placed individuals matching their descriptions in various western states, particularly in rural areas of Arizona, New Mexico, and Northern California. In each case, these individuals appeared to be involved with small, isolated religious communities established shortly after the Millbrook incident. In December 1953, while searching Mercer's rented room at the boarding house operated by Martha Jenkins, investigators discovered a locked steamer trunk beneath the bed. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, they found a leather-bound journal written in what appeared to be a sophisticated cipher. When finally deciphered by Dr. Raymond Lehrer, a linguistics professor from the University of Virginia in 1955, the journal revealed a disturbing narrative spanning over 2 decades. According to the decrypted text, Mercer, which was apparently not his birth name, believed he had been chosen as a vessel for what he termed the Voice, an entity that had first spoken to him during a near-drowning experience in 1931. This voice had allegedly instructed him to identify and release pure souls through ritual purification by fire, thereby allowing them to transcend physical limitations and achieve a higher state of existence. More troubling were detailed references to previous congregations in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and briefly in southern Illinois, where Mercer had served before mysteriously departing. The journal contained elaborate theological justifications for these acts, blending Christian apocalyptic imagery with elements of ancient fire worship traditions and what appeared to be entirely fabricated revelations Mercer attributed to the Voice. He described the victims of his previous fires not as deceased, but as successfully transformed and elevated beyond material constraint. Those who survived, always a small, carefully selected group, were characterized as vessels for continuation, tasked with establishing new communities where the practice could be perpetuated. Authorities in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, subsequently confirmed that a small rural church in West Lampeter Township had burned down in 1949 under suspicious circumstances, with 12 casualties. The pastor, who went by the name Gabriel Thorne, but matched Mercer's description, had disappeared shortly before the incident. Similar connections were established to a 1945 fire at a converted storefront church outside Columbus, Ohio, though records from that investigation had been largely destroyed in a courthouse flood. Perhaps most chilling was the final decoded entry in Mercer's journal, dated November 14, 1953, just hours before the special service was announced. Preparations complete, the faithful have been tested and found worthy of release. Tomorrow they ascend through purification, fulfilling my promise to the Voice. Those chosen for continuation have been dispersed to prepare the next gathering places. When the appointed time comes, we will reunite and bring the holy fire to new vessels. The Voice grows stronger with each ascension. Soon it will speak not just to me, but through many mouths across this land. The transformation spreads like flames in dry timber. The case took an unexpected turn in May 1957, when investigator Franklin Reed, who had led the initial inquiry and continued pursuing leads informally after the official investigation concluded, received an unmarked package at his Richmond office. Inside was a cassette tape containing a recording of what audio experts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation confirmed was Mercer's voice based on comparison with a church service recorded months before the fire. The speaker identified himself only as the Keeper of the Promise, and the message, which remains preserved in FBI archives, contained several disturbing statements. "You believe you're investigating a tragedy, Detective Reed, but you're merely witnessing the first stages of a glorious transformation. Those who burned have transcended physical limitations. They are not victims, but pioneers. Those who were spared have scattered to continue the holy work in fertile ground. The promise made cannot be broken, and the fire will return again and again until all worthy vessels have been purified. Look to the west as the Voice grows stronger. Look to where the mountains touch the desert. The next ascension draws near, and there will be others after that, each greater than the last, until the final purification comes for all." The tape concluded with what analysis indicated were multiple voices speaking in unison, approximately 8 distinct individuals reciting what appeared to be a liturgical response. Through fire we are transformed. Through transformation we transcend. Through transcendence we fulfill the promise. The recording provided confirmation of what investigators had already begun to suspect, that Mercer had not perished in the fire but had escaped, likely through the basement tunnel, and that the 8 missing church board members were now actively participating in his continued activities. In the decades following the Providence Baptist incident, at least 4 other church fires in rural communities across Virginia, West Virginia, North Carolina, and eventually Arizona showed disturbing similarities: charismatic new pastors arriving without verifiable backgrounds, congregations that grew increasingly isolated from their communities, unusual late-night gatherings, and fires that investigators determined had originated in basement areas, modified with sophisticated ventilation systems. This realization prompted a multi-state alert, but the limited communication infrastructure between rural law enforcement agencies in the 1950s hampered effective coordination. In each case, a small contingent of the congregation would inexplicably be absent when the fires occurred, never to return to their communities. And in each case, local residents reported strange behavioral changes in the weeks preceding the incidents. Members selling possessions, speaking of purification and transformation, and attending what were described as increasingly intense late-night meetings. The most significant of these subsequent events occurred in Claiborne, North Carolina, in 1967. The New Light Tabernacle, a previously unremarkable rural church, burned on October 31st, claiming 23 lives. Investigators found evidence of the same chemical compounds present at Millbrook, along with a more sophisticated delivery system integrated into the building's heating ducts. The church's pastor of 18 months, who called himself Simon Radiant, had vanished 3 days before the fire along with 7 members of the congregation. What connected these incidents beyond their methodology was a curious symbol found etched or painted in inconspicuous locations at each site. A circle containing a stylized flame with what appeared to be faces or figures within the fire. Linguistic experts noted similarities between this emblem and ancient Mesopotamian fire worship iconography, though the specific representation appeared unique to Mercer's organization. Since the Claiborne incident, no fires matching the exact pattern have been officially documented. However, some researchers suggest the methodology may have evolved to avoid detection, possibly transitioning from dramatic conflagrations to more subtle forms of psychological control and exploitation within isolated communities. This evolution would be consistent with broader shifts in cult methodologies observed during the late 20th century, as increased awareness of destructive religious groups led many such organizations to adopt less visible but equally manipulative practices. The isolation and social significance of rural churches made them particularly vulnerable to such infiltration, especially in economically depressed regions where declining populations left once vibrant congregations desperate for revitalization. The archives at Virginia Commonwealth University contain thousands of pages of documentation on the Millbrook incident and its apparent successors, including photographs of the strange symbols, chemical analysis reports, and hundreds of interviews with peripheral figures and family members of victims. What emerges from this extensive record is a picture not simply of mass murder, but of something perhaps more disturbing: a sophisticated system of psychological manipulation that turned ordinary people into willing participants in their own destruction. Dr. Eliza Hammond, a psychology researcher who interviewed numerous Millbrook residents in 1968 as part of her doctoral dissertation, noted the recurring theme of complete personality transformation in those who fell under Mercer's influence. What we observed in Millbrook wasn't simple coercion or brainwashing in the conventional sense, she wrote. The victims didn't flee the fire because, in their altered perception, They weren't victims at all, but willing participants in a transcendent experience. Hammond's research suggested that Mercer employed a sophisticated combination of techniques that have since been recognized as common in destructive cult environments: sleep deprivation during the late-night sessions, controlled access to outside information, creation of an yes versus them mentality, introduction of specialized language that reinforced group identity, and gradual escalation of commitments from minor displays of loyalty to extreme sacrifices. Witness accounts describe something more akin to psychological contagion, a transfer of delusion so complete that it overrode even the most fundamental survival instincts. Most effective, according to Hammond's analysis, was Mercer's apparent use of what would now be termed love bombing, overwhelming new targets with attention, affection, and a sense of special selection or destiny. This technique proved particularly effective in the post-war environment of Millbrook, where many residents felt left behind by America's economic prosperity and technological advancement. Mercer didn't simply offer salvation, Hammond observed. He offered significance to people who feared they had become irrelevant in a rapidly changing world. He transformed ordinary congregants into essential participants in what he convinced them was cosmic drama of unprecedented importance. The social context of 1950s rural America created particularly fertile ground for this type of manipulation. Despite the decade's reputation as a period of religious revival, many studies have documented the shallowness of this phenomenon, particularly in rural areas where church attendance often represented social conformity rather than deep spiritual engagement. One sociologist of the era described it as a religiousness without serious commitment, without real inner conviction, without genuine existential decision. This spiritual vacuum, combined with the increasing isolation of rural communities as younger residents departed for urban opportunities, created communities vulnerable to charismatic figures promising deeper meaning and special purpose. The physical isolation of these communities with limited access to outside information or oversight further facilitated the development of closed systems of belief and behavior. The question that continues to haunt those familiar with the case is whether Mercer was merely a disturbed individual who manipulated vulnerable people to their deaths, or whether he genuinely believed in his promise to God. And perhaps more troublingly, were the 8 who were sent away just lucky survivors or intentional carriers of whatever psychological contagion Mercer had cultivated? The former site of Providence Baptist Church remains empty to this day. Multiple attempts to build on the property have been abandoned after accidents, financial complications, or unexplained equipment failures. Locals avoid the area after dark, claiming to hear hymnals singing on certain nights, particularly around the anniversary of the fire. In 2002, an elderly man was found wandering near the site, disoriented and suffering from exposure. When hospitalized, he identified himself as Robert Mercer, claiming to be Lawrence Mercer's son. Hospital records indicate he spoke repeatedly about continuing Father's promise before disappearing from his room during a shift change. No trace of him has been found since, though his fingerprints match those of Michael Hollister, one of the 8 church board members who had disappeared the day of the fire. The official Millbrook case files were formally closed in 1975, though they remain accessible through Freedom of Information requests. The final report cites mass psychological manipulation culminating in orchestrated arson, but notes that without Mercer or the missing congregation members to provide testimony, many aspects of the case will likely remain unresolved. What we know with certainty is that something terrible happened in that small Virginia town, something that transformed ordinary people into willing participants in their own destruction. And somewhere, perhaps, the 8 who were sent away carried with them the seeds of whatever madness had taken root in Millbrook. Some residents of communities where similar incidents occurred have reported receiving strange communications over the decades. Unmarked letters or postcards with no return address, postmarked from different western states, bearing only cryptic messages like, The Promise Continues, or The Fire Purifies Still. The most recent was reportedly received by the granddaughter of a Millbrook survivor in 2019, containing only the words, "The final transformation approaches." Will you recognize it when it comes? Law enforcement agencies maintain a file of these communications, noting that while disturbing, they contain no actionable threats. Analysis of handwriting samples suggests multiple authors rather than a single individual, leading some investigators to propose that whatever organization Mercer created has continued to recruit new members over the decades, evolving from its fiery beginnings into something perhaps less visible but equally concerning. Dr. Hammond, in her final publication before her death in 2008, offered perhaps the most troubling perspective on the Millbrook incident and its apparent successors. What makes these events so disturbing isn't just the loss of life, but the implication for our understanding of human psychology. Under the right conditions, with the right techniques, ordinary people can be convinced to not only accept but embrace their own destruction. The boundaries between persuasion and manipulation, between religious devotion and psychological capture, are far more permeable than we care to admit. The Millbrook case raises profound questions about the nature of belief, the psychology of belonging, and the vulnerability of isolated communities to manipulative leadership. The 1950s are often romanticized as a simpler, more wholesome era, but beneath the veneer of prosperity and conformity lay deep currents of alienation and spiritual hunger that figures like Mercer could exploit. Rural churches of that era served as more than religious institutions. They were social anchors, cultural centers, and sources of community identity in regions increasingly marginalized by America's urban-centric development. When such vital institutions fell under malevolent influence, the consequences could be devastating precisely because of their central role in community life. Tonight, as you listen to this account in the darkness of your room, consider this. Charismatic figures with destructive intentions have always moved among us, seeking those susceptible to their influence. The promise that Reverend Mercer made wasn't to God, but to something far darker within the human psyche, a promise to feed vulnerable souls into the flames of his own delusion. Most troubling of all is the possibility that some form of Mercer's organization continues operating today, having learned from its past to become more subtle in its methods. The techniques of psychological manipulation that once required isolated physical compounds have evolved alongside our technology and social structures. The promise of transcendence, of special knowledge, of belonging to something greater than oneself, these appeals remain as powerful as ever in an increasingly fragmented world. And somewhere, perhaps, those original 8 survivors or their disciples may still be keeping Mercer's promise alive, patiently cultivating new fields for the fire of their terrible harvest. In a storage facility in Richmond, among the boxed evidence from the Millbrook investigation, sits a sealed container holding the partially burned church register recovered from the Providence Baptist fire. The final entry, written in what calligraphy experts confirm is Mercer's distinctive hand, reads simply, "And so begins not an ending, but a glorious transformation. The promise is kept." The final page contains a list of names, those present at the midnight service, with all but 8 crossed out in red ink. Next to each crossed-out name appears a small symbol resembling a flame. Beside the 8 uncrossed names is written a single word, vessels. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Millbrook case is how it reflects our own vulnerability to manipulation. The techniques Mercer employed have been refined and systematized in the decades since, deployed not just by cult leaders but increasingly in political movements, media ecosystems, and even marketing strategies. The boundaries between persuasion and coercion have blurred in our information-saturated age. As Sheriff Montgomery wrote in his final notes on the case, what happened at Providence Baptist wasn't just about one madman's delusions. It was about how easily we humans can be convinced to set aside reason, to ignore warning signs, to follow charismatic figures straight into destruction. I've spent my career believing people are basically sensible, but Mercer showed how thin the veneer of rationality really is. That's the real horror of Millbrook, not just what happened there, but what it reveals about all of us. The church may have burned to ashes decades ago, but the questions it raises continue to smolder in the American consciousness. And somewhere, perhaps, in some remote community, new voices are speaking of purification, of transformation, of promises that must be kept, and eager ears are listening. The true legacy of the Millbrook tragedy may be the understanding that the most dangerous fires aren't those that consume buildings, but those that burn in the mind, kindled by manipulation, fueled by isolation, and fanned by the universal human longing to be part of something greater than ourselves. These are flames not easily extinguished, passing from one generation to the next, always seeking new vessels for their destructive promise.